We begin our reflection in an age of architectural and intellectual grandeur. Imagine Istanbul not just as a crossroads of commerce, but as the pulsating heart of learning, where the domes and minarets housed institutions that defined scholarship for centuries. These were the Ottoman madrasas. Often simplistically defined today as mere religious schools, they were in their prime comprehensive universities that rivaled European institutions. They taught theology, yes, but also advanced astronomy, mathematics, medicine, law, and complex philosophy. They nurtured figures who calculated the precise movements of celestial bodies and engineered groundbreaking architectural feats. They provided a crucial continuity of thought, linking the Islamic Golden Age directly to the early modern period. This system was the bedrock of Ottoman governance and society, ensuring that administrators, judges, and doctors shared a unified, highly intellectual framework. To understand the profound sadness of their eventual closure, we must first appreciate the scale of what was lost. A meticulously crafted network of knowledge that stretched across 3 continents, representing centuries of accumulated scholarly labor and dedication. The seeds of change were planted slowly, starting in the 18th century. As European powers rapidly industrialized and centralized state education, the Ottoman madrasa system, facing internal bureaucracy and a resistance to adopting certain Western military and technical sciences, began to be perceived as slow, perhaps even stagnant. The Tanzimat reforms of the mid-19th century introduced parallel Western-style schools, the mektebs, creating a critical intellectual division within the empire. This created 2 distinct classes of educated elites: the traditionally educated, rooted in classical Islamic frameworks, and the modern educated, deeply informed by French and German secular thought. This tension was the foundation for the ultimate crisis. Modernists argued that the madrasas were inherently reactionary, incapable of producing the engineers and statisticians needed to save the collapsing empire. They saw the traditional curriculum as an obstacle to progress, a system fostering backward loyalty rather than rational citizenship, a perception that tragically escalated the argument from inefficient to dangerous to the state's survival.
The great tragedy, however, was that the critique failed to recognize the dynamic nature of these institutions across history. While some individual madrasas certainly suffered decay, many others continued to be centers of vibrant intellectual discourse. But the political necessity felt by the founders of the new Turkish Republic demanded radical, wholesale change. After the collapse of the Ottoman Empire and the establishment of the Republic in 1923, the focus shifted entirely to nation-building based on strict secularism or laicism. The founders viewed the entire Ottoman structure, including its educational spine, as the historical cause of decline. The madrasas, with their historical connection to the caliphate and the sultanate, were seen as the most potent symbols of the old defunct order. They were viewed not just as outdated educational facilities, but as potential breeding grounds for political opposition and anti-secular sentiment. This ideological perception elevated the madrasas from scholarly institutions to political threats, justifying swift, uncompromising legislative action designed to eradicate their influence entirely from the public sphere.
The decisive moment arrived in March 1924, merely months after the Republic's founding. The Grand National Assembly passed the Tevhid-i-Tadrisat Kanunu, the law on the unification of education. This law was monumental. It effectively nationalized all educational institutions, placing them under the Ministry of National Education. Crucially, it demanded the closure of all existing madrasas and religious schools, integrating their remaining theological functions into state-run Imam Hatib schools and a single faculty of divinity within Istanbul University. The language of the law was focused on rationalization and modernity, yet its impact was profoundly destructive to traditional learning. Overnight, centuries of decentralized, autonomous intellectual life were shut down. Teachers were displaced, students were scattered, and priceless libraries were either absorbed into state collections, often without proper cataloging, or tragically, simply lost. The rationale given was clear. Education must serve the modern state, and the state required a unified, secular understanding of the world, making the multifaceted intellectual life of the madrasa incompatible with the new national project. The implementation of the closures was swift, often harsh, and deeply consequential. It wasn't merely the end of a schooling system, it was the deliberate severing of an intellectual umbilical cord stretching back to the earliest years of Ottoman statehood and beyond. The most devastating immediate effect was the intellectual vacuum created by the sudden unemployment and silencing of thousands of highly specialized scholars, or ulema. These experts, trained in complex fields like fiqh, jurisprudence, tafsir, exegesis, and advanced kalam, speculative theology, were suddenly rendered obsolete by the state. Many went into self-imposed internal exile, continuing their teaching in private homes or small mosques, fearful of state persecution. This forced privatization of knowledge meant that the transmission of high-level, complex scholarship became hidden, fragmented, and eventually diluted. The state successfully removed the institutional structure, but in doing so, it ensured that the sophisticated nuances of classical Ottoman scholarship were slowly strangled due to lack of public space and resources for renewal.
Beyond the closure of the physical schools lay the lasting damage to academic continuity. History shows that knowledge traditions, especially those reliant on personalized master-apprentice instruction, require an open institutional ecosystem to thrive. By centralizing all religious and ethical instruction under a secular state bureaucracy, the Republic inadvertently destroyed the decentralized rigor that had sustained the madrasas for centuries. The sophisticated, often critical internal debates within Ottoman scholarship, the very engine of intellectual life, ceased to have a public platform. Instead of evolving and modernizing, as some madrasas were attempting to do organically, the system was simply erased. This created a profound knowledge gap. Later generations of Turkish scholars often had to bypass their own rich intellectual heritage, looking directly to European sources or even to scholarly centers in Cairo or Beirut, just to access the advanced texts once readily available in Istanbul. This was not just a political shift, it was a cultural self-amputation. The enduring effect of the 1924 law is the enduring difficulty contemporary Turkey faces in reconciling its deep historical and religious past with its aggressively secularized present. Historians today grapple with the fact that, while the goal of unifying education was ostensibly achieved, the cost was the suppression of a native intellectual tradition. The label dangerous was a political expediency that justified the removal of institutions deemed counter-revolutionary. Yet in the rush to modernize and secularize, the complexity and potential value of Ottoman scientific and philosophical contributions were tragically overlooked or deliberately ignored. What many modern historians now observe is that the secular state failed to provide an effective indigenous substitute for the ethical and communal framework the madrasas once offered. The institutions that replaced them often lacked the depth and philosophical weight of the schools they shut down, leading to a long-term cultural alienation between segments of the population and the state apparatus. In recent decades, there has been a significant cultural and political movement to reevaluate this historical break. Many voices in Turkey argue that the wholesale condemnation and eradication of the madrasa system represented an overreach, a revolutionary act that inflicted unnecessary damage on the nation's cultural memory. Efforts have been made to restore certain historical madrasa buildings, turning them into cultural centers or museums, acknowledging their architectural and historical significance, even if their original educational function cannot be resurrected. This represents a nuanced, slow process of historical recovery, an attempt to mend the intellectual fracture caused a century ago. It is a recognition that true national strength comes not from erasing history, but from understanding it completely, including the parts that challenge modern narratives. The silence in those beautifully tiled courtyards today speaks volumes about the sacrifice made for the sake of radical political transformation, and the subtle melancholy of lost wisdom still hangs in the air. The ultimate legacy of the closure lies in the philosophical questions it raises about modernization. Can a society truly leap forward by deliberately jettisoning its past intellectual capital? The Ottoman madrasas, far from being static relics, were part of a vast global intellectual conversation.
Their closure isolated Türkiye from certain intellectual currents of the wider Islamic world, and, ironically, often made later engagement with Western modernity more brittle, locking the foundation of a robust, self-confident indigenous tradition to negotiate change. The political decision to label the madrasas dangerous stemmed from a deep anxiety about political control and unity, but it resulted in a fragmented intellectual identity. We are left to ponder the path not taken. What if the Republic had chosen reform over destruction? What kind of scientific and philosophical synthesis might have emerged if those institutions had been allowed to evolve under state guidance, rather than being summarily swept into the dustbin of history? That what-if scenario remains one of the most poignant historical counterfactuals of the 20th century. In the decades that followed the closure, the vacuum left by the madrasas was partially filled by the new state universities. But the deep specialization and contextual learning, the centuries-old chains of authorization and teaching methodology were irreplaceable. The state was successful in creating a national curriculum, but it struggled to instantaneously recreate the intellectual gravitas and continuity that the decentralized system had perfected. This is evident in the study of classical Ottoman law and literature, where gaps exist today precisely because the primary institutions responsible for training scholars in these complex fields were suddenly and permanently dismantled. The intellectual history of Turkey must therefore be read as a history marked by a massive, deliberate caesura. It is a history that asks us to feel empathy for the scholars who lost their life's work, and for the generations who were robbed of direct access to their rich intellectual inheritance, forcing them instead to reconstruct their lineage through scattered artifacts and distant memories. Today, as Turkey matures and gains distance from the intense revolutionary period, the conversation shifts from justification to comprehension. Historians now approach the Tevhid-i Tedrisat law with a mix of respect for its modernizing intent and sadness for its cultural destruction. The Ottoman madrasas, once deemed a dangerous impedance to progress, are now increasingly viewed as complex institutions that deserved preservation and reform, not eradication. Their story is a powerful reminder that political change often requires painful sacrifices, but that the sacrifice of deep-rooted intellectual traditions carries costs that can resonate for centuries. We look at the empty niches where once the lamps of learning shone, and reflect on the delicate balance required to reconcile tradition with modernity, faith with science, and heritage with national ambition. The echo of history suggests that true progress embraces complexity rather than fearing it. The closure of the Ottoman science madrasas stands as a stark, dramatic example of the cause and effect relationship between revolutionary politics and intellectual life. The cause was the urgent political need for a unified, secular state. The effect was the fragmentation of a centuries-old knowledge system and the creation of a profound, lingering gap in Turkish intellectual heritage. It is a narrative of sacrifice, ambition, and unintended consequences. Thank you for joining us on this journey through a crucial yet melancholy chapter of Turkish history. If this exploration into lost institutions and historical memory resonated with you, and if you believe that understanding the complexities of the past is vital for navigating the future, then we urge you to participate in this ongoing conversation. Don't forget to like and subscribe for more updates and detailed histories that challenge conventional narratives. We deeply value your support as we continue to uncover the stories often forgotten by time.